The clerk behind the counter noticed her hands shaking before she'd even reached for the rifle. "Ma'am, maybe you should sit this one out," he said, loud enough for the whole store to hear. "That's a lot of gun for someone who can't hold a coffee cup steady." She didn't answer. She just picked up the rifle anyway and asked for a target set at 150 yards. What happened next made an old man near the register go completely still, then reach for his phone to dial a number he hadn't used in 30 years, because he recognized exactly whose shaking hands those actually were. Ridgeback Outfitters sat on the edge of a small Montana town, the kind of shop that had survived 3 decades on a mix of hunting supplies, ammunition, and the specific loyalty of a customer base that didn't change addresses often. Rifles lined the back wall in neat rows, handguns sat under glass along the front counter, and a ceiling fan turned lazily overhead against the late summer heat. Vera Kincaid walked in a little after 11 that morning, wearing a plain button-up shirt with sleeves rolled to the elbow and jeans that had clearly been through considerably more wear than a typical Tuesday errand required. Her hands trembled faintly and continuously, the specific fine tremor of someone who had lived with the condition long enough to stop noticing it herself, though everyone who watched her for more than a few seconds noticed it immediately. She walked to the counter and pointed at a bolt-action rifle mounted on the wall behind the register, older, heavier, with a worn walnut stock that had clearly been handled a great deal over its lifetime. The clerk, a young man named Denny Ashcroft, glanced at her hands before he glanced at the rifle, and something about the visible tremor settled his expression into the specific patient condescension of someone deciding, ahead of time, exactly how this transaction was going to go. "That one's a serious piece," Denny said. "Full power cartridge, real recoil. You sure you want to start there?" "I'm not starting anywhere," Vera said. "I'd like to see it." Denny hesitated, glanced toward the back office where the owner was occupied with inventory, and lifted the rifle down anyway, setting it on the counter with the deliberate care of someone handling something he expected to immediately regret handing over. Vera picked it up. Her hands shook visibly as she checked the chamber, verified the safety, and began breaking the rifle down into its components, the tremor never once interrupting the sequence, moving with a fluency that seemed to exist entirely separate from whatever was happening in her nervous system. "Ma'am, maybe you should sit this one out," Denny said, raising his voice slightly, the specific volume of someone performing concern for an audience rather than delivering it privately. "That's a lot of gun for someone who can't hold a coffee cup steady." A woman near the ammunition shelf glanced over. 2 men examining a display case exchanged a look. Vera didn't respond to any of it. She reassembled the rifle in the same unhurried sequence, set it down, and looked at Denny directly. "I'd like to use your range. Target at 150 yards. Denny's eyebrows went up. "We don't usually set the range that far back for dash." He stopped himself before finishing the sentence, though the unfinished half hung in the air clearly enough that nobody needed him to complete it. "For someone whose hands shake," Vera said, finishing it for him, "I understand the concern. I'd still like the target at 150 yards. If something about this woman's calm insistence is already sitting with you the way it should, this is a good moment to send this story to someone who needs to see what happens in the next 90 seconds. Denny looked toward the back office again, seemed to weigh the cost of arguing further against the cost of simply letting an eccentric customer embarrass herself and leave, and settled the target at the requested distance with the specific, reluctant compliance of someone who had decided the fastest way through an uncomfortable situation was simply to let it happen. The range smelled the way indoor ranges always do, cold gun oil and recycled air. Vera loaded 4 rounds, settled into a standing position without a rest or brace of any kind, and went still in a way that made the fine tremor in her hands seem, for a moment, almost beside the point. She fired 4 rounds in steady succession. Denny's spotting scope told him something his eyes needed a second look to fully process. Not 4 holes near each other. One ragged opening dead center of the target. The kind of group that spoke to a relationship with a rifle built over considerably more time and considerably more difficult conditions than a small-town gun shop's indoor range typically saw demonstrated. The range had gone quiet by the time Vera lowered the rifle, cleared the chamber out of old habit, and set it down. "Ma'am," Denny said, his earlier condescension entirely drained out of his voice. "How does someone with hands that shake shoot like that?" The tremor doesn't go away when I'm shooting, Vera said. It's still there. You just learn, eventually, to work with a body that doesn't cooperate the way it used to, instead of waiting for it to start cooperating again. She turned to walk back toward the main floor, and that was when Walt Bregman, 78 years old, a regular at Ridgeback for longer than Denny had been alive, rose slowly from the folding chair he'd been occupying near the register, his own hands beginning to shake now for an entirely different reason. Walt had been watching the entire exchange from across the store, and something about the specific way Vera's hands trembled while her body otherwise moved with total stillness had snagged on a memory he'd been carrying, unresolved, for 3 decades. "Ma'am," Walt said, his voice rough. "Can I ask you something?" Vera stopped. "Of course." "Did you serve?" Walt said. "A long time ago. Somewhere cold, mountain terrain, a long-range program most people never heard the name of." Vera looked at him for a long moment, something shifting behind her steady eyes. "That's not really something I discuss, Walt." Walt's hands were shaking harder now, and it had nothing to do with age. "I had a nephew," he said. "Cal Bregman. He served in a program like that. Came home different, wouldn't talk about most of it, except once, near the end, when he told me about a spotter who saved his unit's entire position with a shot nobody thought was possible, given how bad her hands shook by the end of that deployment. He never told me her name. Said it wasn't his to tell." Walt's voice cracked slightly. He said her hands shook so bad by the last few months that command wanted to pull her off active duty, and she made every shot anyway, because the tremor never touched what happened once she went still. "Subscribe. Actually, forget the formalities. Just stay with us, because what Walt does in the next 30 seconds is the reason this story is still being talked about in 3 different counties." Vera's expression had gone very careful, the specific carefulness of someone deciding how much of a conversation to allow to continue in a room full of strangers. "Walt," she said quietly, "I don't know what your nephew told you, but he died 4 years ago," Walt said, cutting through the deflection with the specific bluntness of a man who had waited 30 years and wasn't going to let politeness cost him this conversation now. "Car accident, nothing to do with his service. Before he passed, he asked me to do something if I ever met the person he described. He said if I ever saw someone shoot like that, with hands shaking that bad, I'd know who I was looking at, and he wanted me to tell her something." "Walt," Vera said again, more carefully this time. "He wanted you to know he made it home because of you," Walt said. "He wanted you to know he had a daughter, and a good life afterward, and none of it would have happened without whatever you did on that ridge. He never got the chance to say it himself. He asked me to say it if I ever got the chance instead." The store had gone completely silent. Denny stood frozen behind the counter, uncertain what he was witnessing, but certain it was considerably larger than the transaction he'd expected to process that morning. Vera was quiet for a long moment, her trembling hands still at her sides, her composed exterior cracking slightly at the edges in a way that hadn't happened during the entire demonstration on the range. "Cal Bregman," she said softly, testing the name out loud. "I remember him. Young, steadier under fire than most men twice his experience." "That's him," Walt said, his own voice unsteady now. "I didn't know he had a daughter," Vera said. 16 now, Walt said. "Looks just like him. Doesn't know most of what he actually did over there. Just that something happened that changed him, and that he came home instead of not coming home, and that he always said there was a reason for that." Vera looked down at her own trembling hands for a long moment. The tremor that had drawn mockery from Denny less than 10 minutes earlier, now sitting in the room as something else entirely, evidence of exactly what it had cost her to be steady when it counted, all those years ago, for a young man she'd never expected to hear about again. "Would you want to meet her?" Walt asked. "The daughter. I could arrange it, if you wanted." Vera considered the question the way she considered most things now, slowly, weighing exactly how much of a door she was ready to open. "I'd like that," she said finally, "if she'd want it too. She spent years wanting to know more about her father's service," Walt said. "I think she'd want it more than you'd expect." The woman near the ammunition shelf, whose name turned out to be Marnie, had drawn closer during this exchange, no longer pretending to browse. "I don't mean to intrude," she said, "but I couldn't help hearing. I lost my own brother, different circumstances, and I remember how badly I wanted someone, anyone, who'd actually known him at the end to tell me something true about who he was in that last stretch. Something that wasn't just the official version everyone else got. That's exactly it, Walt said, nodding at her with the specific recognition of someone who'd found an unexpected ally in a feeling he'd assumed was his alone to carry. Cal's mother got a folded flag and a form letter. She never got anyone who actually knew him to tell her what he was like when it mattered. I can't give her everything, Vera said quietly. Some of what happened isn't mine to hand over, even now, even this many years later. But I can give her the parts that are true and mine to share. That's usually enough, if it's offered honestly. Denny, still standing behind the counter, found his voice for the first time since the conversation had started spiraling somewhere far beyond a rifle sale. I need to apologize, he said, for what I said. About the coffee cup. Vera looked at him, something gentler crossing her expression now than the flat composure she'd carried through the entire range demonstration. You made a judgment based on what you could see, she said. Most people do. The mistake isn't making it. It's not staying curious enough to update it once you've got better information. I've got better information now, Denny said. You do, Vera agreed. The woman who'd been examining the ammunition shelf earlier approached slowly, having overheard enough of the conversation to understand she'd witnessed something considerably heavier than an eccentric customer's insistence on an unusual target distance. I'm sorry, she said, for staring earlier. I didn't understand what I was looking at. Nobody usually does, Vera said. That's not really anyone's fault. It's just how it works, most of the time. Walt sat back down slowly in his folding chair, his own hands still trembling with an emotion 30 years in the making, finally finding somewhere to land. I've carried that message for 4 years, he said. Wondered if I'd ever actually get to deliver it. Wondered if the woman he described was even still alive. Or if I'd made up half the details in my own head after hearing the story enough times. You didn't make it up, Vera said. Every detail was right. Even the shaking hands. Especially those, Vera said. They're the reason Command wanted to pull me. They're also the reason I understood, better than most of my unit, that steadiness under pressure was never actually about the absence of anything shaking. It was about what happened underneath it when it mattered enough. Walt nodded slowly, absorbing that, the specific relief of a man who had finally set down something he'd been carrying considerably longer than he'd let on to anyone, including himself. Vera purchased the rifle and 2 boxes of the appropriate ammunition, paying in cash. The same unhurried composure she'd carried since walking through the door restored now, though something in her had visibly softened in the 20 minutes since Walt had first spoken her old service into the open air of a small-town gun shop. Before she left, she paused beside Walt's chair. How do I reach you, she asked, when you're ready to arrange that meeting? Walt gave her his number, his hand still not entirely steady as he wrote it on the back of a receipt Denny provided. I'll call within the week, Vera said. Tell her, if you speak to her before then, that her father was one of the steadiest people I ever served alongside. Whatever else she's heard, that part is true, and it mattered more than most of what happened around it. Walt's eyes were wet now, unashamed of it in front of strangers in a way he might not have been an hour earlier. He'd have wanted to hear that from you himself, he said. I'm glad I got to be the one who finally heard it instead. Vera left Ridgeback Outfitters a little after noon, driving out of the gravel lot in an unremarkable sedan, the rifle and ammunition secured in the trunk, her hands still trembling faintly against the steering wheel in the exact way they'd trembled her entire drive into town. The exact way they would likely tremble for the rest of her life. A permanent physical signature of years spent doing work that had asked considerably more of her nervous system than it had ever fully recovered from. The story didn't stay contained to that Tuesday morning. Denny told 2 friends that evening, unable to fully process what he'd witnessed without talking it through with someone. And within a few days a rough version of it had made its way through enough of the small town that people who'd never met Vera Kincaid found themselves asking after her at the diner, at church, at the hardware store. The specific, quiet curiosity of a community that had just learned one of its more forgettable-seeming visitors was carrying a weight considerably larger than anyone had assumed. One version of the story reached a retired lieutenant colonel named Frank Osei, who ran a small veterans outreach office 2 counties over and had, for reasons nobody in town fully understood, maintained loose contact with several long-range programs whose official rosters had been sealed for decades. Frank heard the story secondhand from a cousin who'd heard it from someone at the diner, and something in the specific detail of the trembling hands and the 150-yard shot made him set down his coffee and ask several more questions than the story's teller had answers for. He drove out to Ridgeback himself 4 days later, arriving on a Saturday afternoon when Vera happened to be back in town collecting a scope she'd ordered the previous week. He found her at the counter, recognized something in her bearing before she'd said a single word, and approached with the specific, careful formality of a man who had spent enough years around people like her to know exactly how much room a first approach needed to leave. "Ma'am," he said, "I don't want to intrude on your afternoon, but I heard a story this week about a shooter with a tremor and a 150-yard group, and it matched something I read once, a long time ago, in a file I wasn't fully cleared to read all of, about an asset whose hands shook so badly toward the end of her service that half the people who worked with her assumed the reports about her accuracy had to be exaggerated." Vera turned to look at him fully. "And the other half?" "The other half had seen it themselves," Frank said, and stopped questioning it entirely. "Which half were you?" Vera asked. "Neither," Frank said. "I only ever read the file. I never met the woman it described. I always assumed I never would, given how thoroughly that kind of record tends to disappear once the people who could confirm it decide they'd rather not be found." Vera was quiet for a long moment. "What exactly are you asking me, Colonel?" "I'm not asking you to confirm anything," Frank said. "I run an outreach program for veterans who came home carrying conditions nobody in the civilian world quite knows how to talk about. Tremor disorders, service-related nerve damage, the kind of thing that gets treated like a disability by every form and every doctor's office, and never gets treated like what it actually often is, which is evidence of exactly how much someone gave to a job most people will never fully understand the shape of." He paused. "I'd like your help, if you were ever willing to give it. Not with anything classified, just with young men and women coming home now, carrying tremors and worse, who need to hear from someone that a shaking hand was never actually the end of anything worth being proud of." Vera considered the offer with the same careful weighing she'd given every question that had come at her over the past week, testing its edges before deciding how much of herself it was worth extending toward it. "I'd need to think about it," she said. "It's not a small thing, being visible in that particular way again." "Take whatever time you need," Frank said. "The offer doesn't expire. I've been chasing a rumor about you for longer than I've known your name. I can wait a little longer for an answer." He left his own card beside the one Walt had already given her, and Vera stood at the counter for a long moment after he'd gone, looking at both of them, weighing a version of her future that looked considerably less private than the one she'd built for herself over the past several years. Walt called his sister 2 days later, Cal's mother, and arranged the meeting he'd promised. Vera drove back to Ridgeback the following Tuesday, and this time Walt brought his great-niece with him, 16 years old, dark-haired, with her father's same steady jaw and the same particular way of watching a room before speaking in it that Vera remembered from a young man she'd once pulled through considerably worse conditions than a Montana gun shop's parking lot. The two of them sat together at a small table Denny cleared for them near the front window, and Vera told her, in careful pieces over the better part of 2 hours, exactly as much of Cal's service as she felt able to share without crossing into territory that wasn't fully hers to disclose. The girl cried twice. Vera didn't, though her hands trembled through the entire conversation, a tremor that had stopped, somewhere in the past week, being something she needed to hide from anyone in that room. Denny watched the whole conversation from behind the counter, occasionally bringing over coffee neither of them had asked for, and found himself thinking, more than once, about how completely his assumptions from the previous Tuesday had been dismantled by a woman whose shaking hands he'd mocked within 30 seconds of meeting her. He changed the way he ran his counter after that. He stopped assuming that visible tremor, visible age, visible anything told him the whole story about a person's capability, and started asking a few more questions before he decided what anyone standing across from him actually deserved. It didn't make him perfect at the job. It made him slower to conclude, which, he was beginning to understand, was most of what the job had actually required of him from the beginning. Vera came back to Ridgeback periodically over the following months, not often, but regularly enough that Denny stopped being surprised when the bell above the door announced her arrival. She never fully explained her service beyond what Walt already knew, and nobody in that store pushed her for more than she was willing to give. She called Frank Osei 6 weeks after his visit, on a Tuesday evening, and told him she'd thought about his offer long enough to know she wanted to say yes, on the condition that her involvement stayed as quiet as everything else about her life had stayed for the past several decades. Frank agreed without hesitation, and by the following spring, Vera was making occasional unannounced visits to his outreach office, sitting with young veterans whose hands shook for reasons considerably more recent than her own, telling them, in her own unhurried way, that a tremor was never actually the end of anything, provided you learned to trust what happened underneath it when it finally mattered. Some questions, Denny had learned, over the course of one extraordinary Tuesday morning, weren't actually his to keep asking. If this story kept you here until the very last word, that's usually a sign it's worth passing along. Some of the most important people in any room are the ones everyone else already decided weren't worth a second look, right up until the moment they prove, quietly and without any need for anyone's applause, exactly how wrong that assumption always was.